welcome everyone. My name is Aronczyk, Associate Director of the Institute of Public Knowledge. Today, we're very grateful for you to spend part of your Climate Week with us. It's a bit of a space that anyone can just come together and feel sad. So we're doing that for the second night in a row this week. I'm very happy to introduce our panel, but first our featured author, Hanna Morris. Hanna E is an assistant professor at the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto and co-chair of the Critical Studies of Climate Media, Discourse, and Power Working Group, part of Brown University's Climate Social Science Network. Her research, as many of you may already know, concentrates on climate media, democracy, nexus, and explores critical questions of power, making, and climate change. The newest book, which I encourage everyone to order your copy today, we just found out it's on back order from the publisher, so I told him you should brag about that. And also be frustrated about it. Right? Well, you proved them wrong. Yeah. But the book is entitled Apocalyptic Authoritarianism, Climate Crisis, Media, and Power, published by Oxford University Press. She's also co-edited the book entitled Climate Change in Journalism, Negotiating the Rhythms of Time, which is published by Routledge in 2021, and it's published in numerous papers and peer-reviewed journals. Just today to name in this introduction. Here to comment on Hanna's work, we have Melissa Aronczyk and Colin Jerolmack. Melissa is a professor of media studies at the School of Communication and Information at Rutledge University. She's the co-author with Maria Espinosa of A Strategic Nature, Public Relations and Politics of Environmentalism. And is the winner of the 2023 Roderick P. Hart Outstanding Book Award for Communication and the 2022 Outstanding Book Award in Public Relations, Innovation, Development, and Educational Achievement, both from the National Communication Association. Colin is the professor of Environmental Studies and Sociology right here at NYU, and author of the new book, Up to Heaven, Down the Hell, Fracking Freedom and Community in American Town. In 2017 and 2023, Jerolmack was chair of the Department of Environmental Studies here at NYU. So thank you, Colin, thank you, Melissa, for being here, and Hanna, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and taking time to be here. I know there's so many amazing events happening this week and today, so I really appreciate you choosing to be here. Just make sure, can you hear me all right with that? Okay, my throat's a little scratchy from talking really loudly in very loud rooms this week, so hopefully my voice will hold up all right. So thank you so much, Michael, for all of your work in making this event possible. I really appreciate it, and for the kind introduction. And also thank you to Melissa and Colin for your time. I know how busy you are. It just really means a lot that you're here and you took the time to engage with my book. It really is an honor, and I really appreciate it. Okay, so before detailing the main argument of my book, I wanted to briefly begin my talk today with how I approach my project and how I conceptualize the complex interplay of media, democracy, and climate change. As a humanistic social scientist who primarily uses critical and interpretive methods of inquiry, I take context very seriously. To this end, my book traces and reveals how and why certain ways of knowing and responding to climate change have come to be, and how a present regime of truth, which is a phrase that the French historian and philosopher Michel Foucault introduced, so how a regime of truth is challenged, negotiated, or maintained by traditional figures of power, including traditional journalists writing for prominent news publications. It's here where the rupture of Trump's first and now second Trump presidencies have played a pivotal role in shaping how and why climate change has come to be reported on and represented as it is today, within and also to a certain degree outside of the borders of the United States. Researchers of social change often refer to particularly influential ruptures or events in historical time as critical junctures or hot moments, within which there's opportunity to both challenge the status quo and imagine different societal relations and more equitable political structures, as well as the profound risk of falling back onto traditional structures of power and simplifying narratives that deepen as opposed to upend existing inequities. year 2016 in the US, where I'm originally from, even though I'm in Canada at the moment, and was living at the time, certainly felt like a very hot moment, where a lot was in flux. And this heat hasn't come close to letting up with yet another highly fraught Trump electoral victory in November 2024. This heat, of course, I mean metaphorically to describe the intense turmoil brought about with Donald Trump's victory in the presidential election that year and again last year, but also I mean it quite literally too, with the steady rise in destructive wildfires, storms, and flooding intensified by climate change. This literal heating has coincided with the metaphorical inferno of Trump's presidencies, of which the journalist David Remnick describes here on the slide, which you can't probably see, it's highlighted on the bottom there, but he describes in this New York article following Trump's first 2016 election as a moment of revulsion and profound anxiety. 2016 was a hot moment when a sense of self as a nation incinerated for many, and a desperate search for American identity and a so-called return to normalcy became commonplace across opinion commentaries, editorials, and news reports in the US legacy press. In many ways, eliding this hot moment's radical potential for fundamental change, much like what we are seeing again today. The question then is, how on earth are we back here again? And with something even more monstrous than the first time around. In the midst of the November 2024 US presidential elections, in what is now often referred to as the start of Trump 2.0, several high-profile American reporters with deep frustration lamented, why is it so difficult for so many Americans to remember the horrors of Trump's first presidency? Is it a coping mechanism after years of turmoil, including a deadly pandemic beginning in 2020, and a violent insurrection at the Capitol in 2021? Is it willful forgetting? In my new book, I argue that after Trump's first electoral victory in 2016, the 4 years of his presidential term that followed were cordoned off by many public officials and national news outlets as a mere political mirage. Trump 1.0 is so difficult to recall because his presidency was assumed to be an extreme but only momentary blip within an otherwise exceptional and glorious national history. Many American news outlets, from the New York Times to Newsweek to Time magazine and more, played a crucial role in constructing Trump's first presidency as a nightmarish phantasm as opposed to a very material political reality. This cordoning off of the post-2016 present as an unusual and soon-to-be forgotten crisis between an otherwise glorious past and surefire manifest destiny, concerningly and now consequentially, elided pivotal questions such as, how did we get here, and what can be done about it? Sensational doomsday images of an apocalyptic president instead dominated the screens and covers of prominent newspapers and news magazines during this hot moment. In place of uncovering and combating Trump's authoritarian aspirations head-on, news reports and commentaries often opted for an apocalyptic rendering that obscured his actions more than they illuminated them. It became difficult for readers to distinguish one catastrophe from another, let alone remember and keep track of each specific assault on democracy that merged into one indecipherable throng of disarray. Stemming from my critical discourse and visual analysis of climate change news, commentaries, and images published by an ideologically diverse set of the most prominent national US news outlets during the years between Trump's first and second electoral victories, my book argues that in these pivotal 8 years, stories of an apocalyptic total crisis dominated how both the threats of climate change and anti-democratic politics came to be known. Indeed, climate change, which demands both a clear-headed reckoning with and a collective reimagining of politics and business as usual, burst onto the national scene a couple years into this reported disarray of Trump 1.0. In 2019, climate change trended. For the first time in U.S. history, climate change was at the top of the American mind, with the majority of Americans stating that they were both concerned about climate change and wanting to do something about it, both in the immediate near term and the long-term future. Moreover, popular celebrities such as Billie Eilish were singing about climate change, Oxford dictionaries named the climate emergency its word of the year, and U.S. media coverage of climate change was up substantially, and according to researchers at the University of Colorado Boulder, up by 73%, so up by 73% compared to just a year prior in 2018. This is a really striking moment of change. For so many years prior to 2019, climate communication and journalism scholars in the US were largely concerned with how to accurately and effectively communicate and translate science so as to raise widespread public concern and encourage robust climate action. But now people were concerned. The attention was there. Public awareness, interests, and motivated desire for comprehensive action were all evident in the US for the first time. Americans wanted radical change, not a return to so-called normalcy. And yet the ultimate direction that climate journalism could take stifled as opposed to bolstered that momentum. Like the soundtrack, sort of. That's
New York
momentum.
City, New York City.
So notably, many of the most popular visions for how to effectively respond to the threats of climate change and the anti-democratic politics of Trump came from youth-led, and in particular, young women of color-led, climate justice groups and progressive grassroots movements. These movements formed prior to 2019 in the US, before the media took serious note of climate change. Progressive climate activist coalitions like the Sunrise Movement began in 2017 in the wake of the Trump election and built upon decades of community organizing. As to the development of the widely popular, at least at the time, and I'll return to this, but at the time, the widely popular Green New Deal, which proposed a more inclusive and robust climate policy-making process that centered Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, as well as working-class oil and gas laborers who have been historically left out of climate and energy conversations on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. But through an apocalyptic representation that subsumed climate change into an amorphous milieu of disarray, responses to climate change were demarcated by many mainstream media as either right or wrong, based on a tenuous calculation of whether a response was deemed capable of bringing back national stability and normalcy, or deepening the present state of perceived disorder even further. And it's here where the popular young women of color-led climate justice movement of the late 2010s, including the Sunrise Movement and the Campaign for a Green New Deal, championed by young progressive congresswoman of color Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who against all perceived odds won the midterm elections in 2018, ousting a long-standing Democratic Party figure. But these young progressives were reported on as wrong by major national news publications, from the center-left New York Times to the center-right Wall Street Journal and more. Before these major newspapers reported on the Green New Deal as an extreme political response led by an extremist political movement, the key tenets of the Green New Deal were supported by 81% of the American public across partisan and state divides, according to major national polls in 2018. So 81%, so that's a huge statistic. And then after rampant media fear-mongering of the Green New Deal in 2019, through which the policy resolution was reported on as socialist, anti-American, and at risk of suspending the nation into a deeper state of total crisis, public support very strikingly shifted away from the policy proposal and facts. Legacy media publications like the New York Times and establishment Democratic Party politicians like Sean Patrick Maloney, who clearly lost the 2022 midterm election and blamed young progressives like Ocasio-Cortez for his loss, continue to repeat and amplify what are essentially Republican talking points and fearmonger about the so-called new left as a profound threat to the U.S. nation-state and its supposed God-ordained manifest destiny to spread the light of liberty across the world as a so-called city on a hill, as an ideal, superior, and model society that all of the nations should strive to be like. My book reveals how it is through this othering and fear-mongering that a concerning concretization of the boundaries around who should and who should not be included in climate decision-making processes and in American politics altogether is taking place across U.S. journalistic and political discourse. Young female climate justice activists of color are clearly being othered and delegitimized as uncivil subjects who should not be included in climate, party, or national deliberations. There's a growing consensus across the U.S. national press, from the center to the right, that a woke or so-called new left is a destabilizing force that must be stopped. At the same time as these young women of color are represented as threatening to national stability and impeding a return to normalcy, many news reports conversely celebrate green tech and market so-called fixes developed by older, whiter, and more moderate and reasonable men the right and sensible response to climate change, fully capable of steadying the ship and reorienting the nation back on its previous course of man's destiny as visionary sages. In my book, I show how this demarcation of right and wrong responses to climate change, be the disparagement of young men of color in a historically marginalized group in the US, and glorification of older white men in a historically privileged group in the US, is indicative of wider patterns in US media and political discourse following the tumult of Trump's 2016 election. It is here where I identify an emergent mode of reactionary discourse in politics that I call apocalyptic authoritarianism, which I know is a mouthful. In short, apocalyptic authoritarianism describes the reactionary posturing and political alignment of historically privileged figures transcendent of the party's center and right who are united through a common enemy of the new left and a shared appeal to apocalyptic visions of total crisis. Fear-mongering of a supposedly America-hating contingent of woke-focused radicals who are threatening the nation and impeding the earth-saving work of visionary sages is precisely where apocalyptic authoritarianism in the US hardens the line between us and them. According to this reactionary logic, only traditional authorities and pro-American saviors will bring back order by eliminating all unruly others who are leading the nation astray and away from its God-ordained and glorious manifest destiny. Some would-be apocalyptic authoritarians even fantasize about the demise of all but themselves in the event of earthly destruction. This morbid fantasy presumes that there are individuals who will inevitably be saved and others who will inevitably be damned within an impending climate apocalypse. Men like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk, for instance, view themselves as akin to gods, empowered by the supposed superior intellectual capability to choose who to save and pull up into the life world of apocalypse bunkers and space colonies, and who to let drown and die with the damned in the death world below. Naomi Klein and Asher Taylor, in a very recent essay published by The Guardian, have called what I term apocalyptic authoritarianism as end-times fascism, but really singularly focus on the far right in their analysis. In my book, I reveal how this troubling and morbid imaginary of what the future holds also shapes many climate change stories published by major national news outlets in the US, which often amplify elite figures' advantages. This is happening within, but also very much beyond the extreme margins of the far right and the so-called digital manosphere. These religious inflected tropes of American male exceptionalism defy one clear ideological through line and are leveraged by prominent figures from MAGA right to the moderate center to advance their own power. But one thing is clear: many national news stories and commentaries on climate change are entrenching as opposed to questioning these figures' claims of absolute authority. Each chapter in my book shows how visual and textual news media representations of climate change are often characterized by four recurrent tropes that also lie at the crux of apocalyptic authoritarianism, including firstly, appeals to nationalism and discursive processes of othering, which I detail in chapter 1. Secondly, the celebration of planetary scale solutions of the green tech and green capitalist variety, which I detail in chapter 2. Thirdly, the admiration of visionary sage figures, which I detail in chapter 3. And fourthly, the necropolitical claims of the supposedly inevitable climate deaths of racialized others, which I detail in chapter 4. Together, these four dominant tropes that I discuss in each of my book's chapters fan the flames of apocalyptic authoritarianism and hinder more deeply contextualized ways of making sense of and responding to the complexities of climate change. Notably, at the center of the post-2016 US climate feed are nostalgic memories of America's yesteryears that are brought forward in news stories, images, and commentaries to in part provide a clear sense of direction amid this perceived total crisis. National myths of grandeur, exceptionalism, and dominion have been reactivated within a nascent post-2016 climate feed, a feed that, as I've already detailed, took definitive root in 2019. Significantly, there's an evident desire for a return to an imagined post-World War II golden age in particular. This was a period in time when the US collectively remembers itself as having been the great stabilizer and moral authority in global affairs, supposedly again fulfilling its God-ordained manifest destiny as a city on a hill. It is not inconsequential influential that this romanticized period in time predates the civil rights movement and the radical pro-democracy politics of the late 1960s, which demanded more equitable economic and political arrangements, and also challenged in many ways the myth of American exceptionalism, a myth which positioned the US as the world's ultimate and superior society. This pre-civil rights, early post-World War II era, before the mass pro-democracy movements of the late 1960s, was a period when historically privileged figures in the US, including traditional journalists, writing for prominent national news outlets across the political spectrum, were on more solid ground. This privilege is precisely what many young social and climate justice activists are again questioning, just like their progressive forebears, and also precisely what traditional terms of power are desperately trying to cling to, protect, and fortify once more. Again, this outright animosity towards the perspectives of those a part of the so-called new left is taking place across US media, even among so-called centrist center-left publications. But the rampant media fear-mongering of young and diverse climate and social justice activists and representation of them as a threat to the US ultimately works in favor of an anti-democratic and a right-wing political project, and it's often a deliberate strategy used to delay and obstruct any and all climate action. The threat of Western civilizational collapse is repeatedly leveraged by leaders on the right, for example, and their allied fossil fuel industry peers, to impede systemic transformations of the economy and government, including a just transition away from fossil fuel energy. The narratives of petro-nationalism, for instance, the fossil fuel industry and conservative advocates in the US Congress, repeatedly leverage apocalyptic images of Western civilizational demise to invoke fear and anxiety around supposed further loss of an American way of life if the US moves away from oil and gas and towards renewable energy too quickly. And as we saw earlier this week, with his speech at the UN, Trump is advancing exactly this argument. But the majority of Americans do want a just transition to renewable energy. So not just a transition, but an equitable and just one that benefits all and not just a wealthy few. Notably, however, while a majority do support a just transition, poll after poll also shows that the same majority of people do not think that other Americans share their point of view. Pessimism, in other words, abounds. Social ties are clearly broken. Collective action is kept at bay, and where democratic modes of governance are kept under reach, when pessimism and distrust of peers and neighbors abound. Clearly, it serves an elite captured state's best interests to keep collectivities broken, social ties shattered, fears high, and thus the formation of cross-partisan alliances and organization of collective action at bay, even if this means through police violence and force. At the same time as there is an evident concretization of what I referred to in my book as a militant climate justice warrior stereotype across national news media, there's also been a spike in police repression of young climate justice activists on the ground. Climate protesters are being charged with existing and newly created anti-terrorism laws in various nations beyond the US, from the Philippines to France to Germany to the UK and more. Again, what is so striking and so crucial to understand is that this othering and criminalization of young progressives, and especially of young progressive women of color in particular, is not just emanating from the far right and its digital manosphere. It is also coming from the moderate center and the traditional so-called legacy press. As you can see here on this slide, with the New York Times recently calling the young climate justice activists from the Sunrise Movement who co-led anti-Tesla protests in Manhattan as violent, thus contributing directly to Trump's framing of these very same activists as dangerous, threatening, and terrorists, and to Elon Musk's fear-mongering, which probably can't be in the slide there, sorry, it's quite small, but Elon Musk's fear-mongering of these protesters as part of a nefarious, anti-American conspiracy with clear Cold War era anti-communist Red Scare undertones. So in returning to this question of how are we back here again, I want to add an amended question of how did we let this happen? My book reveals and details how the we here is not referring to the pro-democracy organizers and activists who have been working tirelessly to contest the deeply hubristic roots of American exceptionalism and its emergent politics of authoritarianism, but rather this we refers to so-called moderate center and not just the matter rights, including a largely unreformed My book shows how in the age of Trump, the most prominent news publications on record in the US are bolstering, as opposed to questioning, the reactionary currents of apocalyptic authoritarianism as it manifests today. And with increasingly concentrated ownership and privatized enclosure of social media spaces, such as Musk's takeover of Twitter, and now the likely co-purchase of TikTok by the even wealthier man from Silicon Valley, Larry Ellison, coupled with the increased physical policing of progressive movements and gatherings on the ground, as seen most hypervisibly over the past few weeks in particular, there are fewer and fewer alternative forums where these mainstream narratives can be countered and tested. Climate journalism does not need to be like this. It can move beyond a nostalgic longing for an imagined national past and overt celebration of male savior figures. In place of fear-mongering about young, progressive women of color and their transformative visions of political economic change, prominent newspapers and news magazines could instead comprehensively engage with and accurately report on these popular, not extreme political perspectives. After all, the desire for transformative change is the rule for most Americans, not the exception, according to a slew of polling data. Despite notable efforts by a few private media initiatives, such as Covering Climate Now's recently launched 89% project, which urges journalists to report on the 89% of people in the world, and this is according to cross-national polling data, who want comprehensive government-led climate policy programs like the Green New Deal. So despite this 89% project, most major news publications continue to cover the climate story with wary caution directed at protest movements and mass politics more generally, or in other words, a robust democracy. A reimagined climate journalism capable of contending with and combating apocalyptic authoritarianism needs to center many different subjectivities and engage with as opposed to fear and fearmonger about mass democratic politics. This is an entirely possible, as well as entirely needed task during these boiling hot moments of anti-democratic and climate threats. So thank you, I will leave it there and then open up for discussion, and this also is a QR code in case you're interested in buying the book. There's a discount code there too. So thank you so much for your attention.
Okay. I don't know if I'm standing or not either, but maybe just to keep consistency, I will. Hi, everybody. It's really fun to be here. It's also one of those things that makes the passage of time feel really quickly. I remember meeting Hanna as a graduate student when I gave a talk at Penn. It didn't really seem that long ago. And I remember being really impressed by your ambitious project, and now it's kind of crazy that it's published already, but that probably longer ago than I thought, I guess. But it's really, really neat to see it in fruition from just talking about it those years ago. And I think that one of the things I really appreciate about this book is that I think that Morris has really put her finger on something important that I feel like me and probably a lot of other people felt this imbrication of the climate crisis with creeping authoritarianism, but wasn't really able to articulate or think about how they're really coming together. Are they just simultaneous crises, or there seems to be some way they're connected? And I think that in doing so, you really definitely separate the signal from the noise, showing how the media, sometimes perhaps intentionally, other times perhaps more willfully, has helped amplify right-wing narratives that opportunistically seize on the climate anxieties that many of us have, to blame, for instance, developing countries for spewing their pollution and climate migrants on the rest of us, to elevate the godlike status of free market sages like Elon Musk, and to demonize progressive movements like Sunrise and progressive environmental policies like the Green New Deal as somehow radical chaos agents. But I'll say one of the things that I appreciate most about this book is its analysis of what the media doesn't say, the stories it doesn't tell. Absent, for instance, as Hanna already alluded to, are any stories at all, it seems, of agency or creative solutions among people in the developing world, even when they're not demonized. They're portrayed as hapless victims that are waiting for clean technology for wealthier countries to come save them, and their own sort of perspectives and ways that they are going about doing their own worlding are left out of the stories that are told. Absent, as well as any consideration, as she points out, of the legacy, for instance, of colonialism in abetting eco-apartheid, or the intersectional nation of oppression. And I think that these absences, these things that are just not even talked about, are as telling as what is said. So I have a number of provocations / questions that I want to hear what Hanna thinks about. And I guess the first one is, there's this thing that some people talk about called the authoritarian hypothesis, which is that democracies are actually ill-suited to take sufficient climate action at the pace and the scale that is required. For instance, if you think that most politicians are on 2 to 6 year election cycles, why should they put all their clout behind some policy that might not bear fruit for decades down the road, right? People say that they care about environmental issues, but if you ask them to rank order their preferences and what it is they vote on, it's never first, second, usually not even third or fourth. So if I'm a politician that has to make decisions, I'm going to pick economic first, maybe cultural issues second, and how that might get in the way of thinking about doing something about the climate. I mean, one of the ways I often like to say this is that the carbon cycle and election cycles don't sync up, right? And so some people have posited, you particularly see this in people that take a more global comparative aspect that, so for instance, when a country like China decides it wants to do something around green infrastructure, bam, it can do it. I'm not saying China's doing a bang-up job, but it's once you see that there's an interest, they can just pull all the levers, and it's not up to provinces, locally elected officials, to be able to stand in the way and stop it. It happens, right? So some people, philosophers, social scientists, others have sort of advanced this idea, not that they're comfortable with it, but should we think about some of the ways that aspects of democracy might work against climate action? I mean, another way that this plays out, and even in very grassroots way, is what people have often called the yes in my backyard movement, right? We allow, if you think about zoning and local democracy, well, people don't want a lot of new shit in their backyard, right? They don't want a nuclear plant. They don't want a gas well. They also don't want an electric transmission line. They don't want a wind turbine. They just don't want stuff, right? And so a lot of people have argued that you really gotta basically do things, and they don't want, of course, dense housing, right? So we gotta do things that are good for the planet, and they argue this not from the perspective that a lot of the folks are reading about here, like what's going to protect the interests of an elite few, but at least they argue it's a utilitarian argument. We got to do what's in the greatest good for the greatest number of people, so that might sometimes mean that particular local communities, we take away some of your say to control land uses so that we can bring in denser housing, electric transmission lines across your backyard, which might require using eminent domain, but these things are going to be in the service of providing a green infrastructure, reducing emissions, greater dense housing that will bring down prices and affordability for everybody. So that's why we need to do these things, right? And there's a tension there between doing that and at least local democracy, right? And so these were some of the questions that I was thinking about this. That largely I group under this authoritarian, or at least democracy as a potential problem kind of hypothesis and argument. I wonder as well about, Hanna's way too smart and careful to say this, but there's kind of this lurking feeling I get in the book that there's such a thing as mainstream or traditional media that is important enough, it reaches enough of a critical mass of people that it matters what they say, because it's going to really influence what a lot, if not most of Americans think. And, that was the case perhaps in the Walter Cronkite era. I'm curious about with the media landscape not only so fractured, but the argument that in addition to its fragmentation, that many of us are living in our own kind of filter bubble. It makes me wonder about whether media has the power that you imply that it does. So does one way to ask this question is does the media today drive our perceptions and beliefs around who's deserving and who's not, but who's to blame for the climate crisis? Or is it more serving as a confirmation bias? The algorithms already just feed us stories that can confirm what we think, or we immediately reject any other kind of perspective as fake news and move on. And so, I wonder what you think about that. I also have a methods question. I don't mean to get too academic or wonky. I really wanted a methods appendix or in-depth footnotes about how you were thinking through the stories that you read. Because one of the approach that the book takes, which is in a lot of ways a similar approach I would take it as an ethnographer, is you consumed a lot of stories, but you choose to dissect several stories in depth in chapters, so that what we don't get per chapter is there was 55 stories like this, or out of the 85 stories that touched on this trope, the amount of them that adopted this narrative with this. And I'm not saying I want tables and statistics, but I found myself sometimes like halfway through a chapter, like, okay, we've really been talking about like 1 or 2 articles, and then you invoke like, this is a for instance, this is frequently how it's done, this is usually how it's done. And why I think I felt like I wanted that, aside from transparency, was like, probably like a lot of people, I'm not that creative with the media that I consume. And probably like the source that I read the most that's like a traditional journalism source is the New York Times. And I found myself, and I flipped and like looked at the citations of all, like there are a lot of New York Times reporters who weren't cited or talked about. And that in my own reading of them, I'm like, are they as bad as this story here? I mean, I think about like Lisa Freeman, who actually has an article saying how people support the Green New Deal, but once there was the Fox News effect, they didn't. Coral Davenport, who else? I wrote down some names, whatever. There's like, that basically like David Wallace Wells is like the one New York Times writer who gets the extensive treatment, and fair enough, but you talk, the book talks a lot about people on the climate beat, and he's more like the idea guy that's going to be in New York Times Magazine than the beat writer like, I wrote down her name, Hiroko, what's her last name? Yeah, who's like writes a lot about oil, who's like going out to Louisiana, writing about the new petrochemical plant, right? Like those kinds of beat writers. And I found myself like, I read those writers a lot, and I'm sure they're definitely excluding certain stories and perspectives, but I didn't really feel like they were doing like the Wallace Wells thing, right? And so that's when then I really wanted to know more about like, you probably did read articles by them, and you probably did code them somehow, you know? But they didn't come out, none of their stories were analyzed, I don't think. But okay, all right. I gotta do a better name search then, because I searched the names through the text.
I didn't want to focus specifically on journalists individually.
Okay.
Because it's more, it's like journalists, it's so hard to be journalists.
Yeah.
And it's also like a lot of it is this was a moment of really perceived crisis. They were called enemy of the people by Trump, and so really trying to search and navigate for a sense of solid ground.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's in the time period I look at, even these content writers, you see these coming searching for these narratives and trying to find a sense of American identity. Mm-hmm. And Mr. Freeman has written pretty narrative about people. Mm-hmm. And I've done your stuff, for example. And I do have that in chapter 1.
All right. I think, for instance, too, like the chapter that focuses on the visionary sages, it makes sense that at least what's presented, like what's analyzed the most, is like Bloomberg Business Week, which I would certainly expect to be the place where, and I know they're not the only ones doing it. I've seen that story, but it's like, I found myself like, the business media is going to be the ones that are going to focus on the sort of tech geniuses and the like. So, and I guess the last point, or question is, we've had a lot of books on climate denialism, so we don't need climate denialism. And I think that I think probably why it's not so much here is because you're focusing on a group of media people that are not so far right that they're acknowledging the climate crisis. But I wondered in a way just even how quickly things have changed that some of the narratives about like, for instance, that the narratives about like people from poor countries that are going to quote invade us, like climate migrants. I just found myself, as you mentioned, like I was like Trump doesn't care. Like this whole administration doesn't even care if India is polluting more than the United States is, and like they don't want to gain any political points off that. They don't even care why people may want to migrate to the U.S., whether it's the climate crisis or not. They just don't want migrants. And so I found myself like thinking about how the reascendance of a doubling down on like climate denialism from the 80s or 90s, and how it's like sort of squares with this like the idea of like the Peter Thiels and the Elon Musks who are going to go into developing countries with their clean technology and save it. So that's what I have. And I just want to, I do just want to close by saying, like, again, this is an incredibly ambitious and thought-provoking book that sadly could hardly be more timely for helping us understand the current moment. And so I congratulate you.
Do you want to respond now? Okay.
Yes. So, okay. So the first question, thank you. So the first question, talking about how there's often the argument that authoritarianism actually could be a way of actually responding to climate change, and you mentioning how it's difficult moving the grid sometimes to green energy because of actually what you're saying, local level climate, local level politics. And so my response to that is that I think that both of these do really fall in line with my argument in terms of there is a perceived total crisis that demands that there's just a few people that will be able to navigate out of it. And I talk about a lot in my book how there's this latent fear of the masses, I call it fear of the masses syndrome, that I talk about in my book, where in a lot of, because this, and again, I take various, also in response to your methods question, I take a really contextualized approach and look, and I really focus in on not only what a deeper, longer history that this moment fits into, but also very much what is happening in the post-2016 moment. And this is a period where there is, again, this desperate search for American identity, and also a feeling of mistrust of people around you, of this feeling that there needs to be a different direction, and that won't be through sort of a mass response necessarily, or a distrust in a mass response. And so in a lot of, for example, yesterday I was at the New York Times Climate Forward event, which was really interesting seeing that, and they had the sustainability officers from Google and Microsoft talking, and they were saying how very much the argument you were saying about how it's super important to move the grid to these different energy sources, grid energy sources, how there needs to be faster permitting processes, and that's also what Energy Secretary Chris Wright also said. They're very aligned with that. They want to streamline and make permitting processes faster. And so this is very much in line still with this idea that if, in order to strengthen the U.S. as a nation, and constantly China is mentioned as, so that China doesn't lead the way and the U.S. is left behind, then there needs to be this quick, fast, rapid movement to change the grid into these new technologies. And so this very much is in line with the argument that I show in my book, and kind of how this was used to also push back against the Green New Deal, for saying that this policymaking process, this new policymaking process, where it includes a lot of different people, it includes oil and gas leaders in the discussion too, that was positioned as being really problematic in keeping this necessary quick movement. And so, and then going to, it's just related to the last question you had about how often Trump is saying, it's just outright denying climate change. And so, what his Energy Secretary, Chris Wright, who I got to listen to yesterday, he is not denying climate change, and is also saying, he literally said he's very passionate about pulling people up in Africa out of energy poverty. So this still very much exists, this idea. Trump, interestingly, and that's why I, the argument in the book, I really kind of caution, and this goes to your traditional media question, why I first of all, a lot of the New York Times, the publisher, A.G. Silver, calls New York Times traditional media, and he says, after commentary after commentary, saying we need to save traditional media. we need to go back to the old ways, which are often romanticized as post-World War II kind of moment. And when the US and also journalism and kind of stories that journalists tell themselves in these old newspapers were sort of providing a stabilizing force for the world. And so, Trump is saying that, I forget where I was going with that, but Trump was saying that, he's just denying it, but it's very much assuming, and this is in line with Elon Musk, for example, who are just assuming that there's going to be inevitably people that are always going to die, and are always going to be poor, and the US is not up to the US to give that to them. It's a very necropolitical claim, and also claims this idea of the US being exceptional, who to choose, who to save, who to let die, which is still in line with this idea that this right, for example, is saying with deciding to pull up Africa out of energy poverty. And so they're very much connected. And I can see that in these traditional media stories that, New York Times does not support Chris Wright. They brought him in to kind of deride him a bit yesterday, but is still reporting on climate change in ways that actually amplify some of these perspectives. And also the identity that New York Times has, and journalists, not just New York Times, but just an example, I was just using this example of yesterday's New York Times convention exercise. They really, and A.G. Sulzberger, what I was saying, the publisher of the New York Times, really seeing itself as a civilizing force. So journalists needing to, for these elite publications, need to civilize the masses, because if they're left to their own devices, it's going to lead the nation astray. And I talk about in my book how there's an identity with journalists really emerging and newspapers emerging when nation states, modern nation states, really began forming, and seeing they're very much connected. And so even though there is not Walter Cronkite anymore, there's still really this strong, and I show in my book, this reactionary momentum happening in these big newspapers, where instead of thinking about, okay, how can we regain trust in leadership? How can we, have different narratives? How can we actually see it? How did we get here? And not just blame the masses, actually think about ourselves. There's this entrenchment of this buckling down on a civilizing mission. So I think that's really important to take a look at. And even though there's a lot of different media sources, these are really important, powerful publications, and there's a reactionary impulse happening there too, in addition to the right and the far right. And so for my methods, I remember talking about this with Melissa actually, had a similar comment, and that was my decision because I talk about, in the introduction, I lay out my approach and talking about how I don't want to take a positivistic approach to analysis, and that is always going to have some pushback and some question about it, and I very much lay out how I chose the media that I did. I have a footnote showing the publications I looked at, and I did go into how my method and my approach was seeing really taking a look at context, and I in particular draw upon I talk about Stuart Hall and his tradition of how subjects and subjectivity are formed, and then also decolonial and post-colonial conversations with the work of Stuart Hall and Michelle in terms of how identity is formed. And so I did purposely not want to have a lot of numbers and charts and statistics just to be in line with some of these traditions of writing. But I do also, like I mentioned, purposely don't name individual journalists except for a few cases because of, and I talk about this in the introduction to kind of to my logic, because it is so hard being a journalist, and they also don't get paid a lot. They're sent death threats. They're doing really important work, and that's why I wrote this book. It's so important, and so it's not necessarily. It's just showing that it's so hard reporting on climate change. this reactivation of really strong, again, reactionary, nationalistic identities in reporting that I did not expect to find necessarily. I wasn't expecting to find that, and it was quite evident across the board. Like I don't just talk about Bloomberg in that chapter. I also draw upon the Republic, which is a really left-leaning publication, and I showed the image of Bill McKibben with World War II and Lonnie Klein, for example. Clearly, really important, amazing leader on the left, and her and her brother Seth Klein constantly talking about World War II as this kind of this just attention to the need for scale and mass action to respond to climate change. And so I argue that there's many different narratives around World War II that could be reactivated. For example, women in the workforce, more diverse workforce, but oftentimes it's used, at least in the way it's being picked up and taken in these news publications. It's often to advocate for a nostalgic kind of feeling of a national unity, just a few leaders that can lead the way out. And it's hard when I think that it's a slippery slope when you start bringing in kind of major events like World War II. And it's interesting that it's in Canada right now, like World War II is kind of again as like another way of trying to respond to the US and the warmongering happening. So it's really interesting in my book. I didn't expect to see how much this imaginary World War II played, but it really does and it continues to play a big role. And I think that that is something that is not just in the word. All right, I think I'll stop there.
Is it okay if I stay here? Stay. I just want to start by saying this book, those of you who don't have a copy yet, there's some really amazing color images.
They're expensive,
No,
I guess.
yes, if you know academic books, you know that is a hard get. So this is also a really good archive at this moment. So congratulations on this important, clearly timely, as Colin said, and really complex book. I found this book very compelling for a number of reasons, especially for the way Hanna reveals the intersections of climate change narratives, with national identity, with our news media, and then with this really problematic treatment of groups along the lines of race, gender, class, and age by national political institutions and media. So the book brings what I see as a very devastating and very necessary critique that even among those who think they're working hard to develop responses to climate change, there's a real misinterpretation of the problem and a continued exclusion of people who are central to the cause. And a lot of those people are not only the ones who are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change, they're the people who are the most motivated and the most willing to do something about it. So I really felt this in the book as Hanna showing us a kind of defeatism and a real cynicism in our so-called legacy institutions that is just so frustrating and backward-looking. That really helps us think about that. I was really interested, I'm going to just focus for a minute on chapter 1, which again, I know not all of you read it yet, so just to give you a sense, it's called A New Marshall Plan for the Climate, Reclaiming National and Journalistic Authority through the Myth of American Exceptionalism. So this chapter provides a very strong set of statements about how Cold War logics have structured a lot of the grand narratives that journalists draw on in the climate coverage, really a lot of binaries. You've got the moderates versus the militants, we've got the patriots versus populism, we've got our rationalists versus climate warriors, and all of these types of divides. And at the heart of these narratives and these binaries is a nostalgia for an earlier time when the national community was imagined to be more stable and more united. And of course, especially in the context of today's political chaos, Hanna points out that centrist and left-of-center publications keep referring to the good old days when the US was recognized and respected for its power and its quote-unquote exceptional authority to do good in the world. So even though we know now, and ostensibly then, that this American exceptionalism was actually buoyed by very rigid hierarchies and considerable exclusion, a a lot of Americans are buoyed by this vision of national identity, and maybe this is part of why journalists rely so heavily on it. It works, it's effective. But here's my question. At the end of that chapter, Hanna writes about nationalism. And she says nationalism is a rigid conceptual container and extremely difficult to break. So the sense I get in this chapter is that you believe that the container should break, that nationalism is really an obstacle to climate activism gaining steam. And as I reflect on that, what really comes to mind for me is the incredible power, the emotional power and valence of nationalism through time, and what that power means for us going forward. You know, that's national identity is a category that is very meaningful to people all over the world. It's a form of representation. Nations is this week. It's a source of self-determination. You know about that in Canada and Spain and Sudan. So there's no question that 21st century national jurisdictions are also sharing or fighting over responsibility at sub-national levels and also at supranational levels. But there are very important ways in which nation states remain the dominant medium of organization, of legal frameworks, of financial networks, and of rights and responsibilities for citizens. So I really just sort of ask about that and kind of where do you sit around there. How, you know, if I ask this provocatively, I would ask, is there a way to reclaim national and journalistic authority without nationalism? That seems to be what you're suggesting, but that might be another person. My second question, which Hanna may have anticipated because we've shared a lot of discussions on this topic, is about the impact of climate obstruction on our ability to develop alternative futures for our media and for our country to respond to climate change. And there's been an incredible upsurge of academic research to respond to even more incredible upsurge of obstructionist rhetoric, and not just rhetoric, but also activities, where oil and gas producers and collaborators actively work with so-called legacy news. Again, by legacy news here, I'm referring to television, newspaper, radio, but also social media platforms, AI companies, technology firms, PR firms, advertising agencies, to promote disinformation that is clearly stymied climate policy. That's at the very least helping to create the environment that Hanna was talking about, where even though there's a generalized support for climate action, there's a confusion about whether other people actually have that support. And disinformation is not necessarily the cause, but it certainly correlates with that. Obviously, financial motivations are part of this problem because the corporate control of our media, importance of advertising revenue to media companies is all related to that mix. And I can't stress enough here how these contrarian views, these kind of climate denialist views, are also not just about a few influencers or a few think tanks, but is really part of a very vast network of actors who are not even necessarily ideologically aligned. It's a very different set of allegiances that is creating this network of climate obstruction. So I really value your thoughts on what journalists and policymakers can do about that. And one last thing that I want to say, I don't know how many of you were struck by this, but I couldn't stop thinking about this as I read this book, which was how dramatically I felt the generational divide reading this book. The way you talk about climate activism and the way you center the kinds of people who are not part of the conversation, I feel like you could write in that way, in a way that some of us just are not even aware of. We're not in those circles in the same way. So it really started to get me thinking about how maybe the generational divide is eclipsing, or maybe even not just eclipsing, but structuring all of the other kinds of divides that we talked about in this book, whether that's gender, race, class, and so on. So I really wanted to ask about how, to what extent you think that as time goes on, the next 10 years, 15, 20 years, as one generation sees the newer ones, although of course with the job scarcity and with medical transformations, the older generation is all living longer, that's going to be slower, more protracted process than it might otherwise have been, but can you reflect on how that generational gap is informing your thinking about what's next?
Thank you so much. I also think you both have been very helpful throughout the process of the publication of this book, so
It's your book later.
so there's a lot of hate given towards millennials. So I think it was interesting to me seeing when I was still doing my PhD, I started noting how there were very quickly and early on, and I talk about this in chapter 1 in my book, that there was this generational othering happening in reporting on the Green New Deal in particular, and it being linked explicitly with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who was a very important champion of the Green New Deal, but she wasn't the only one. But a lot of media coverage across the political spectrum it was just fascinating seeing how the Green New Deal is described as a millennial policy, as being out of step with the average American because of that. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez described by her age before gender and race a lot of times. And it's also really interesting seeing too how the Green New Deal really, 2019, like I mentioned, was a really fascinating year where a lot of narratives kind of emerged and became entrenched in important ways. And so we had the Green New Deal on the one hand, which was being framed as a sort of crazy millennial idea that was just not like the direction that should be taken. And then you also had younger activists, in particular Greta Thunberg, who I talk about in the book too, and in particular in chapter 3 where I talk about visionary sage figures. Greta Thunberg is associated and described as, of course, being part of Gen Z, and was described very early on as being sort of a visionary sage. And so I talked about how this was applied to her in ways to kind of differentiate her from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who's described as radical, closed-minded, myopic, extreme. And Greta Thunberg early on, she was the Time Person of the Year, for example, on the cover, and it showed her like as this prophet figure looking out at the ocean with light on her face, her hair flowing, and really looking out into the future, really long-sighted, a leader of moral movement, not really attached to any particular political-economic policy necessarily, just advocating for existing structures to just do better. And so I saw really interestingly also this description of millennials versus Gen Z in interesting ways, and then you had also boomers blamed for like everything too, and these generational stereotypes that were really used to describe climate politics in ways that I argue in this book and then some of my other papers too, that these generational stereotypes are actually used to explain politics as opposed to deeper political economic structures. And so being seen as sort of, boomers being like a immoral, horrible generation kind of blamed, as opposed to these capitalistic structures of power that have been put in place, and slow reduction of democratic participation, that were restructuring of power that made it harder for people to participate in democratic politics. And I saw a similar kind of positioning of millennials too, as being. So I really wonder how millennials are going to be talked about in the future, because and we unfortunately don't have some great figures in this generation from Silicon Valley, etc. So I think that it's interesting to see how these stereotypes, generational stereotypes, are used to sort of explain immorality and explain politics. And so that was really interesting to me. And the first question too, in terms of Cold War narratives, and that very much structure not just reporting on climate change, but also are used as signposts for a lot of reporting and a lot of unfolding events. And like you said, journalists are trained to try to simplify complexity, and use this as a common way of understanding and navigating the world, and it's one very particular national identity and excessive nationalism. And so I argue in my book that this is just a very constricted national identity that is closing off the ability to think about other national identities. And I talk about in conclusion a lot about this in terms of how to push against this idea of there just being one rights ways of being an American, for example, and a lot of it being framed as collapse of the nation. And so there's a lot of restrictions on identity that are entrenched in a lot of stories. And so I draw upon an idea, for example, of Zapatistas and the idea of a world where many worlds fit. And that can be a really different way of thinking about identity and national identity. And also the idea that national identity can change. It takes fluid and it can change. And I think being open to that is would be an ideal way of approaching reporting. And so that also, for your second question, and I swear I'll be brief, but in terms of how journalists and policymakers can respond to the increased disinformation, and sort of the also limitations in alternative spaces to sort of contest these mainstream, maybe limited narratives, and that just reminded me of how difficult it is to have these alternative forums to really provide navigation through disinformation and provide navigation through these limited narratives. For example, in this era, too, a lot of really important climate journalists, for example, in Westervelt, in Acton, left really kind of mainstream legacy presses to start their own kind of alternative climate media spaces. So starting in Westervelt, started Drill Media, and then Acton started Heated, and so they use Substack newsletters originally to do that. And it was very interesting because during COVID, Substack, it's a tech company. The owners of the company didn't believe in vaccines, and so they chose to promote misinformation around COVID and COVID vaccines. And so that led to in Westervelt, for example, leaving Substack and going to do a platform called Ghost. But it's really hard because they rely on subscribers, and it's really hard to make a living. And in terms of what policymakers can do, it can be, having supporting these journalists in alternative spaces, making sure that Substack, for example, is being, it often says we're just a tech company. It's not our job to moderate or regulate the content, and so thinking about different policies around that, and there's a lot of really important work doing that. So I think just climate journalism is part of that.
We have about 2 minutes for questions. Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk and the research. A question of what you think the role is of climate journalists in, I guess, the current political moment. And by that I refer to Zoran Mandani in New York City, who kind of received a big groundswell of political support, both from people who historically vote for Republicans and Democrats. And I don't think it's limited to New York City. I would say similar political platforms locally in other states. And I'm also seeing some sort of discourse online about how in the current moment we need to be laser focused in terms of communicating bread and butter issues, the type of communication that Bernie Sanders tends towards, very like dairy table issues, cost of living, building affordable housing and such, which partially but imperfectly maps onto climate solutions. And so I'm just curious if you think there is a tension between this sort of bread and butter communication versus the more sort of Green New Deal inclusive type of framing of climate change, and how you think climate journalists should act in this?
It's a great question. Yeah, I think that a lot of climate journalists, and also just in general in political discussions happening now, it's assumed, and even yesterday, it's just such a recent experience, I'm just being where the New York Times journalists were talking and the guests that they chose to interview, just sort of saying, oh yeah, the climate that has passed, people don't want to hear about it anymore. And that's an assumption being made though among it's elite group. But the fact is, when you look at these polling data, again, where it's above 80% of people are really concerned about climate change, really want to see government-led action on it. It is an important issue, and also people are seeing it impacting their bills, and need to insurance policies after their homes are burned in a wildfire, for example, or increased energy costs, and they are connected, and people do see the connection between them. And I think that again, there's a sort of pessimism, a kind of elite pessimism in people, and assuming that they just don't care about it, and that it'll hurt them politically. And that's actually not true, and that's what I showed in my book. Actually, really was the case in this period between 2016 and 2024. There was this consistent, really stifling of this momentum, where climate change actually is a really important way of building political coalitions, and especially for the progressive left. Their policies being extremely popular. But when it's associated, when you have the stereotypes attached to them, or the spearmongering attached to them, or in claim that's going to lose votes, it's actually more damaging than the actual policy itself. And yeah, I think the mayor race is super interesting in showing how popular these policies are. And I think too, there's a recent study that I just saw that actually published today that one of the major issues is that people, again, just showing that poll after poll shows people care about climate change and want government-led action on climate change. A lot of countries, including the US, but they don't trust that the government will do that. They kind of are worried. They don't believe that. They believe that it's corrupt, essentially. And so the same thing for journalists. There's a lot of belief that journalists are corrupt. There's not a sense of trust in sort of these. And so instead of reflecting like how these elite power structures even need to change, there's again this entrenching for this needs to be more. This is the people are dangerous. We need more to kind of this is the right way. And so I think that that's actually more damaging than just talking about climate change.
I'll quickly add that it was close to a year ago we had a panel discussion on the Green Deal. 5 years later, after the convened, one of the featured speakers was Undani. There were maybe 7 or 8 people in the room. And it was the week he announced his campaign, and people were like, wow, that's a really nice video you put on Twitter. He's totally polite and charismatic, even in front of 7 or 8 people. And then, yeah, it's still like the next mayor of New York City. Think of that or what you will. Yes, it's an IDK vote. Yes. Next question.
Thanks so much. This is really interesting, and I teach a number of environment classes. This is some great as well. I'm really curious your thoughts about the association of migration and climate, especially of writing discourses, but I think it's across the left. I was struck by Donald Trump's speech at the UN, in which he said migration in the interviews is up. And my sense has been over the past couple of years is that the consolidation of the southern US border and the consolidation of Europe's southern border has gotten quite a bit better. I'm just wondering how closely you see these and if you could elaborate.
Yeah, so I do talk about that in the 4th chapter of my book, because it is quite apparent. And again, it's not just on the right wing where it does fit into our existing narratives of anti-immigration, and so a lot of stories are told about how dangerous places, you're dangerous people, and so they are going to bring violence and destroy the West. There's a very racist, xenophobic narrative that unfortunately it also appears in more moderate centrist narratives too around climate change. And this has been, a lot of different scholars have pointed out this issue in the way that climate change migration is talked about in beyond just right-wing circles, and being to be careful about representation. And I talk about it in the 4th chapter, just some of the images are used in more centrist and left magazines and newspapers too. They show sort of the stereotypical, like, poverty-stricken people. Even the image I showed of showing after a hurricane, a black woman with her arms stretched out, like she was sacrificed almost. And so just kind of making it,
I was gonna see if I can find
Yeah.
it for you. It is a very striking image, but you can keep going.
yeah, and so this continued stereotype of it being like it's a dangerous, poverty-stricken world that also will inevitably be lost. And
I didn't mean to have your notes there.
okay. And so that is something that I actually talked about, and I think is really striking. And I saw, to a greater degree than previous narratives around climate migration in this period, where you can see it now with the discourses that Elon Musk uses, for example, fearing that the white population, there needs to be like more white populations, and also just claim of really fantasizing about the death of a lot of people who aren't white, basically. And so this kind of representations of the inevitably damned, or these are places that they don't have any autonomy, they either will be saved or not, but it's not up to them. And so that I talked about before we talked about my book, it really closes off political arguments for political participation, in terms of if it's claimed that a lot of people from the global south are going to be already lost, or they're already dead, then that closes off including them in thinking about how to respond to climate change, and further advances the US as being the ultimate kind of decider. And so climate migration narratives around it are pretty complex, and are moving, what really worries me is that it is moving into a really alarming direction in terms of almost, again, figures on the far right, but hyper visible, but almost fantasizing about these kind of deaths. So having hyper borders, part of that, but also military. Also it leads to popping up militarized borders too, of saying we need to keep people out, and they should die. So it is alarming to see that.
Thank you. I was curious about a note that
Can you speak a little louder?
Sure. I know that you focus primarily on traditional media like New York Times as well as publications. But I was curious then if you have more insight or came across more information about right now when we're talking about like these information silos that essentially happen on these digital media platforms, especially with TikTok, right? Especially with the younger generation, personally with people that use that as their main like search engine to find things at this moment. Right? Because it used to be Google was kind of this main linking it to traditional staff, which is really like you have behind you in the New York Times, right? And so I was wondering then when we're talking about this potential, divide when it comes to age developers who start getting their information from, what are your own personal thoughts on whether this is potentially, exacerbating the issue of how framing and ultimately sculpting the narrative of climate change right now, or if you see any hope essentially in maybe that we can kind of push through these like filters.
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. So first, a lot of, unfortunately with AI technologies, there's a lot of kind of taking existing news articles and then changing that into sort of an AI generated, very similar article that is then shared across these different platforms. And so there is a lot of kind of basically plagiarized reporting that is appearing to be alternative or not from a news source, but oftentimes it is, or it's from, for example, Hanna Atkins, I mentioned, who started her own Substack called Heated, which provides an alternative source of kind of reporting. She also talks about how, she just recently talked about how it happened in her reporting too, how it was taken and it was essentially plagiarized through AI technology, shared and went viral. So I less and less space for these alternative kind of forums to push back. It's unclear what is coming from where. It's unclear how to build trust too, and that's even it's just leading to it's leading to just essentially less and less space for knowing where to go. Basically, they're just these things and where to get information, and that does lead to a problem that I argue in my book in terms of these kind of traditional publications could be really responding to this moment now and recognizing that there are a lot of issues in terms of trust and trying to really, instead of cater even more and more to elite audiences and perspectives, actually really trying to change their reporting and do things differently. And there's just not that happening. And so I think there's a really important opportunity right now for a lot of different kinds of reporting, but again, what really struck me is that there's this entrenchment of not wanting to do that. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that's what came to mind for me.
I was going to ask a kind of related question, which is what sort of background should a writer have who is dealing with the climate because it's so complex?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, again, I feel bad asking too much for journalists, and I think that my answer is similar, where journalists, instead of it being seen as just the one who's providing all the information that needs to be, that then educates everyone. And that's sort of what a different kind of reporting, actually talking to a lot of different people. Really, climate change is super complex. There's different experiences that people are having, and there's different forms of knowledge in terms of there's different experiences, different ways of responding. A lot of different countries doing really fascinating things that aren't necessarily featured in U.S. reporting on climate change. And so reporters actually do the job of reporting and talking to a lot of different people. And so I think that there's, like you said, climate change, there's this idea of it being so complex and needing sort of to just educate people about that. But things have changed a lot in terms of what I mentioned. People are concerned about climate change. They do think it's real. They do want to do something about it. And so I think climate reporting needs to now really talk to that 89% of people, for example, and actually try to learn what are many different ways of responding to climate change. So I think that also could build trust too, or the question of trust that is really a problem.
One last question. Archie.
Since we have you who works in Canada and we have a Canadian in Japan, I was wondering how different is the climate reporting in Canada versus the US, and how much your arguments would apply to the Canadian reality.
Another one.
We have some Canadian plants here in the audience, and always make sure to scout like that.
Yes.
Also Canadian, so pattern here. It's somewhat related, but maybe more conceptual. I was just wondering, I thought the discussion of identity was really interesting. I agree that identity is, all group identities are fluid and different from context. So I was wondering how you would maybe imagine national identity to solve a problem like this.
Yeah. So I do try to take a stab at that in the conclusion chapter. So, but again, it's not my place, and the big argument across it is there is no silver bullet, there's no one clear, this is the way, this is how this is done. And I think again, it's really being open to understanding that there can be many different identities, and it can still be like a world where many worlds fit. It can still be a part. It's not going to be damaging across the structure, actually, can be embraced. And so I talk about how, in particular, because I do sort of replace this in just in my research, because it showed that cold war narratives and early post-war World War II narratives and identities really dominated in terms of what I saw here. And this was a period too where there was increased globalization. Immediately after, also 1989, immediately after, too. And so this period where there was a kind of search for national identity and stability, and also too, a lot of scholars like David Harvey, for example, talk about how this resurgence of nationalism in very specific bounded ways was meant to unite a sort of enemy workforce, so that there would be less attention to local economic inequalities. And so I think being aware of the constructive nature of these national identities that are actually preventing more equitable political economic structures in these really interesting form of nationalism that isn't the way it is in the US, for example, right now. And for Canada too, I'm not a Canadian, so I don't want to talk too much about it, but I think it is interesting seeing this moment where it's an interesting time in Canada, and there is a lot of, I think, this question of like, what is a Canadian national identity because of Trump's attack on Canada. And so there is this interesting kind of, I feel like I've been a disaster everywhere I go. So I was living in London when Brexit happened, and then I moved back, and Trump was elected, and it's interesting to see what will happen with that. But right now, there is the Carney government, for example, seems to be bringing nostalgia to the fore, and that I think is going to be limiting these different possible national identities that could form on the others.
What about the Canadian press?
Oh, so I'm not an expert on the Canadian press. So it's only been my experience anecdotally from right now living there, and in terms of climate change, that is what I've been noting and continuing back with this book project is this real, again, powerful World War II narrative and how to respond to climate change and Trump. And so it'll be interesting to see thoughts on that, but I mean that is clearly a really strong narrative that is happening again in different places. And I also see that happening a lot of international contexts, this maybe World War II as well.
I was interested in your comment about China. I mean, if you have an authoritarian regime like China pushing green, it sort of breaks it has to be I guess it's the opposite political spectrum, but still it's tied the authoritarianism to the climate change talk. I mean, I was in Singapore, and Singapore has a lot more green and also very authoritarian. So I don't think they could go necessarily 100% together. Maybe they do here. But I think the mistake that people do is that they use US as the only example.
No, I'm not using that. I'm looking at how a lot of, like, my critique is that, actually, and how that there is this closing off in this moment when there could have been an actual reckoning. There's an entrenchment of American exceptionalism that happened. So, and yeah, I think that it's closing off the learning on the basis, and it's complicated with what's happening in China right now, and so I don't go into that, but we can talk more about it.
Well, Hanna, thank you. Melissa, Colin, thank you. And encourage everyone to purchase a copy of Hanna's book. You can see the QR code right there, or the bookseller outside can help you. Thank you all for